Okay, this is going to be a ring making tutorial in case any of you guys wanted to get started planning. Hopefully you guys will watch this and then you can come in and start working ahead of time if you're worried about finishing everything before Thanksgiving break. So I'm going to walk you through the steps of making your ring, and then class next week will just be work time for me to help you on either of your two projects. So that's kind of the plan for today, and yeah, we'll walk you through it. Okay. We are going to walk through the steps that are listed on your handout. The first thing I need to do is figure out my ring size. So we have two different ways to do that. We have this little plastic sizer and the metal sizers. If you're comfortable using the metal sizers, there's only a few. I would suggest using this. They're a little more accurate. If you look closely, you can see there's numbers on them. Those are your ring size. This is US ring sizing. So I'm just going to try one on until I find one that fits me. This is a size 6. The dash on the metal ones is actually a half size, so that's a 6.5. And if I would rather use the plastic ones, there are more of them and they're also easier to clean. I'm going to use it like a zip tie, slide the end through there, and tighten it up until I find one, again, that fits me. So nice and snug and secure. If that is where it's landing, that's a 6. This one also has little half notches. So either way, figure out your ring size, step 1. Step 2 is going to be to determine how long to cut your piece of metal so that it is the correct size. So I want to make a size 6. Over here on this column we have a size 6. There's also a picture of this in your handout at the very bottom. So size 6. And then we are using 20 gauge metal. So that's the thickness of my metal. The thicker your metal, the longer your piece of metal has to be to create the same ring size. So I want to make sure I'm in this column over here, the 20, and find when that intersects with my 6 and I get 54 straight on. That refers to millimeters. So that's 54 millimeters is how long my piece of metal is going to have to be in order to fit me. Okay, so that 54 millimeters, you probably have a ruler, a plastic one in your kit. If you do not, there's a bunch of metal ones in the wooden cabinet over there. The piece you're starting with is 20 millimeters by 60 millimeters. So I do have a couple of considerations to make. That measurement is for a closed solid ring, and we are making an open adjustable ring. So depending on how large I want my gap to be, I kind of have to take that into consideration with my measurement. So 54 millimeters was my starting point, but if I want a decently large opening, like this is 8 millimeter opening, I'm going to subtract that 8 millimeters from my 54 starting point. A ring like this doesn't really have. It actually has a little bit of overlap from this end to that end, like a 2 millimeter overlap. So that gets added to my 54 millimeters. So yeah, your final measurement will change a little bit depending on what your design is. And if you're having trouble figuring that out, let me know. But I'm going to go ahead and mark on my metal using some kind of marking device just where my 54 millimeters is, right there. So that as I'm starting to plan out my design, I have that just as a reference. Okay, so before I start cutting my metal, I want to have an actual design laid out and planned out. You are only getting one piece of silver, and it is one of the most expensive parts of your lab fee, like the biggest chunk of your lab fee. So make sure that you know exactly what you're doing before you start sewing this. I would highly suggest doing a paper layout first you can cut it out with your scissors and kind of like wrap it around your finger. Make sure that's kind of a good style. That's what you're gonna want and like. This is a template for this ring, so I knew what it was gonna be before I cut it out, and I was happy with it. For this ring today, I'm gonna make this little design. Yeah, I just traced around my piece of metal on a scrap of paper, and then, as you can see, drew out my design on there. I can also, at this point, if I want to, plan my texture. I'm gonna do some like right along the edges right there to just add a little bit of detail. But I made my final sketch 50, oops, I did it wrong. It's 55 millimeters, so I need to make it a little bit shorter. Another reason I'm doing this on paper instead of just going straight to my metal. So I'm gonna adjust that, glue this paper to my metal and saw this shape out, and then we will come back. Okay, so I have my piece of metal cut out, and the next step on your schedule, your process list, is step number 7, which is to add the texture to your metal. So again, you kind of have some, this is where your creativity and design decisions come into play. So it can be a very simple texture, like this one, just has a little A stamped into it. It can be a texture over the whole surface. So you have lots of possibilities. I'm going to show you a few different ways to do texture right now. And then, yeah, depending on your method, you will kind of alter what you're doing. So I want to always practice first. Once you do a texture, like again, an intentional denting of the surface of your metal, you cannot undo it. So get a scrap out of the scrap bin, which is in the wooden freestanding cabinet, and we're gonna do some practices. So all my texturing I wanna do on a steel block, and all the tools I need to texture are in the cabinet underneath the drill press. So there's a variety of hammers in there, and there's also this little UPS bag of stamps, as well as this little box which has letter stamps. So the first kind of option is just the aggressive overall texture, more like this ring. I can hammer it, whatever the face of this hammer is, looks like, that's the type of mark it's gonna make. So this one's kind of like crunchy and has some little dents in it. So, but it also has like a very slight curve to it. So it's gonna leave kind of a gentle cup shape with little marks in it. This one is smoother and tighter, so it's gonna leave a smaller, deeper cup shape. That's a little smoother. So I'm gonna go ahead and do those two real fast. Okay, so that top one was the little, this hammer, which is kind of your typical hammer texture. If you like get jewelry with hammer texture, that's what this one is. This one is a little more like subtle, overall kind of crusty texture. So I think I'm gonna go, well actually, first or second, stamping. So if you want a more like specific little mark, you can use a stamp to create that. Again, this little box right here is the whole alphabet, so I can pull one out. I'm gonna use this hammer, but the flat side, which is the first and only time we use the flat side, and place that where I want my mark. This is the exact same process as my center punch for drilling a hole. Hold it in place, give it a couple hits, and I randomly chose a 5. There it is. So I could do a whole word if I wanted to. I could just do an initial. In this UPS bag, we also have assorted stamps. So this one just like a straight line, but we also have little patterned ones as well if you want to kind of create a pattern. So, whoops. Okay, those examples, this is one reason I suggest you practice so you can kind of get an idea of how hard to hit it, and also some of them like to kind of bounce around, which is why that one's not very clear and crisp. That one's better. So yeah, you can play around with the stamps in this bag. There's a whole bunch. So whatever you want. Again, this one just has like a little straight line stamp in the leaf veins. You can do initials. On mine, I'm going to do this little hammer texture because I like how that looks. So I'm gonna go ahead and do that, and then I'll show you when I'm done. Okay, so I've textured my whole piece of metal. It's shiny and beautiful, but it's really warped. So if you do texture the whole thing, it will kind of warp because it's just stretching my metal out. So in order to flatten it, I'm just gonna flip it over this way so it's curved like that. Gently hit it with my wooden hammer, and it should flatten right out. Okay, so the next step I'm gonna do is file my edges like normal. So I want them to be nice and even and neat. A lot of times hammering kind of, I don't know if you can see that, kind of like squishes out some of the edges. So filing is just gonna kind of clean that up. So no matter what kind of texturing you did, if you did stamping or if you did texture over the whole thing, the next step is going to be filing. If you have a ring like this one, should be a little more symmetrical than it is. Like this curves don't totally match. If you're doing a ring like this one, I would file it to make this part totally round. And I want this width here and this width here to be even. So yeah, filing, again, like always, part of your craftsmanship grade. If it's symmetrical, it should look symmetrical. If it's something a little more organic, I still wanted my band to be the same width in the back, and just to kind of clean up my leaf shapes. So filing is your next step. And then I'm also going to sand. So sanding changes a little bit depending on what your design is. Because I textured this whole entire surface and it's really nice and shiny, I do not want to sand over that because it's gonna kind of like scratch it all up. So for this ring, I'm only going to sand the back. And texturing also kind of like gets the back all scratched up. So I'm gonna do my best pretty aggressively with the 220 to kind of clean that up. So yeah, again, I'm not gonna sand the front if I have hammer textured the whole surface. But if I have just done some stamping while this thing is still flat, I would sand the front and the back. So if you just have a little subtle texture like this one or this one, the whole fronts and the whole backs should be sanded. If you have an aggressive texture on the front like this, only the back. Okay, so I have my piece filed. It's nice and symmetrical. I kind of rounded my edges right there so they would be a little less sharp when it was finished. My back is sanded. So after that, you can kind of see it's still a little lumpy, and that's just from the texturing on this side. So it's not going to be perfectly flat, but I do want to remove all the scratches. At this point, I'm ready to go ahead and make it round. So if you guys are in the studio, you're going to come over to this counter where the kits were, and we're going to be hammering it around this ring mandrel. If you are not in the studio, you do have your wooden mandrel and this plastic hammer. This metal one works way more easily, but you can still accomplish it with the wooden and plastic tools. So I'm going to use metal mandrel, wooden hammer. A wooden hammer is not going to leave any marks or scratches. If I use a metal hammer, I'm going to kind of ruin the texture I did. So I'm going to come over here, and I'm trying to make a size 6. So on this mandrel, you can see, it has the sizes listed on it. So I'm going to go to my size 6 right there, and I'm going to start at the end and just barely sticking the...
Check if it'll stay, if I can see you in the video.
No, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just going to scoot it closer. Okay, so I am going to just barely hang this edge off and start on one end. You can see it's starting to take the shape of my mandrel, and as I go, I'm going to keep scooting it up, and doing a little bit at a time. So it's starting to take the shape. Once I kind of get halfway, I'm actually going to go to the other side over here and start at this end. Again, hammering at my size 6 right there. If you guys are using the wooden mandrel and the plastic sizer, you can adjust this to your size, put it on the mandrel, and make a little mark right there, and that way you know you're hammering towards a size 6. Not quite as precise as the metal one, but that will help you a little bit. Okay, once I kind of get this, there we are, U shape, I'm going to put it on the mandrel and hold both of these sides and kind of squeeze a little bit and hammer on these parts, and that will make me kind of the rest of the way round, which is what I'm going for. Okay, the hammering process also requires, I guess, a little bit of finagling. So you can see this is not like totally lined up. So I am gonna have to kind of move it by hand a little bit. If I want that gap a little closer, I can kind of squeeze it to get it closer. It will misshapen it a little bit, and then I can just put it back on the ring mandrel and kind of fix that. So it's a little bit of a back and forth process to get it to be perfect, but my goal is perfectly round and also a ring that fits me. So keep messing with it until you get it round. That is part of your craftsmanship grade. It should be nice and round and not like weird and lumpy and irregular. So back and forth on the mandrel, off the mandrel, squeezing and then rehammering. Also sometimes flip it and turn it the other way. Kind of, adjusting so that's lined up. But ta-da. Okay, so once I have it totally round, my last step is going to be doing any like touch-up sanding. So you guys can see the inside got a little bit marked up while I was hammering it. So I want to go back in there and clean that up. And I want my inside sanded up to 400. So I'm going to take, I've already done it. I just kind of need to touch it up a little bit. A piece of 400 or wrap it around a pen or your file. And you can put it on the inside and kind of sand in a round motion following the curvature of your ring. And that will kind of help you get your final touch-up done. And once you guys do that, that's your last step, number 10 on the process list on your handout. So yeah, at that point, once it fits you, you can see the inside looks a lot better now. I didn't get the ends all the way yet, but it's close. So yeah, again, you can see nice and symmetrical from the filing, inside cleaned up from the sanding, and it fits me and it has a texture. Those are your big graded elements.